In the spring of 1996, a small community in Warrick County, Indiana, was shaken by a crime of terrible violence. On a quiet night in late March, three young people, Jay Tyler, his wife Kathy, and their friend Brandy Southard, were brutally murdered at a rural intersection. They had been shot with a high-powered rifle and stabbed. It was the kind of shocking event that leaves a community searching for answers, and it was not long before authorities had a suspect. His name was Matthew Stephenson. What followed over the next 30 years would become a legal saga, unlike any other in the state's history. The case would see the longest and most expensive trial Indiana had ever known, a decade of appeals, and a final, unexpected ending behind prison walls. It is a story of how the search for justice can twist and turn through courtrooms for decades. On the evening of March 28, 1996, Stephenson and a friend named Dale Funk were driving around the county. They ended up at the home of another friend, Brian Mossberger. According to testimony later heard in court, Stephenson had his SKS assault rifle with him. After some target shooting, the two men drove to a mobile home belonging to Brandy Southard and her fiancé. Funk told the court that Stephenson went inside and came out carrying a splitting maul. How did that piece of evidence connect to the murders? The timeline moved quickly from there. A pickup truck carrying Jay, Kathy, and Brandy briefly pulled into Mossberger's driveway. Mossberger later testified that Stephenson saw them and said, "There goes Jay, and I've got to catch him." Funk got back in the car with Stephenson, and the chase was on. Funk provided the only eyewitness account of what happened next. He testified that Stephenson chased the truck through the rural roads until it stopped at an intersection. Stephenson grabbed his SKS rifle, got out of the car, and opened fire on the truck. He got back in the car, drove around a corner, and walked toward the truck on foot. When he returned a few minutes later, he threatened Funk, saying, "You breathe a word of this and I'll kill you." The two men drove straight back to Mossberger's house. There, Mossberger testified that Stephenson held up a knife with red smears on the blade and announced, "Jay, Kathy, and Brandy are no more." He washed the knife in the sink and told Mossberger to get rid of the rifle. The next day, Mossberger buried the weapon in the woods. When police discovered the truck the following morning, they found the three victims inside, dead from a combination of gunshot and stab wounds. Forensic testing would later match the fatal bullets to Stephenson's SKS rifle. With evidence like that, you might think the case was open and shut. But the legal process was just beginning, and it would prove to be anything but simple. Stephenson's defense team argued that the murders were actually the result of a drug operation gone wrong, and they pointed to other people they believed were involved. On May 8, 1997, after more than 4 months of testimony, the jury got the case. They deliberated for only about 3 hours before returning a verdict: guilty on all counts. 3 counts of murder, plus burglary and theft. The penalty phase was brief, lasting only a day, and the jury recommended the death penalty based on the fact that Stephenson had committed multiple murders. On June 16, 1997, the judge formally sentenced Matthew Stephenson to death. For the families of Jay, Kathy, and Brandy, it must have felt like the end of a long and painful journey. But the journey was far from over. After a conviction and death sentence, the case moved into the appeals process. Stephenson's first appeal went directly to the Indiana Supreme Court. In January 2001, that court affirmed both the conviction and the death sentence. The court reviewed many of the issues raised by the defense, including challenges to witness testimony and claims of juror misconduct, and found no reason to overturn the verdict. For Stephenson, this was a setback, but his legal team was just getting started. It was during the next phase of appeals, the post-conviction proceedings, that a crucial detail emerged, one that would change everything. Throughout his entire trial, Matthew Stephenson had been forced to wear a stun belt concealed under his clothing. A stun belt is a device worn around the waist that can deliver a powerful, painful electric shock to control a defendant's behavior. At the time of Stephenson's trial, in 1996 and 1997, there was no Indiana law specifically banning them. But here's the critical question. Should a defendant be forced to sit through his own trial in fear of being shocked at any moment? And what does it do to a jury's perception when they learn about it? The problem was made even worse because Stephenson's trial lawyers, well, they never objected to the stun belt. The Indiana Supreme Court actually took up the stun belt issue in 2007 when it reviewed Stephenson's petition for post-conviction relief. The court recognized that making a defendant appear in visible restraints is, by its nature, prejudicial. It really undermines the presumption of innocence, interferes with the defendant's ability to take part in his own defense, and, honestly, damages the dignity of the court proceedings. The court even pointed out that, after Stephenson's trial, Indiana had decided stun belts shouldn't be used in state courts anymore. But, because Stephenson's lawyers hadn't objected during the trial and hadn't brought up the issue on direct appeal, the court ruled that he couldn't raise it now as a separate claim of error. The only way he could move forward was by claiming his lawyers had been ineffective for not objecting in the first place. And on that point, the Indiana Supreme Court ruled against him. The court said that, even if his lawyers should have objected, Stephenson hadn't shown that the trial's outcome would have been any different if they had. So, the conviction and death sentence stayed in place. After that, the case went to the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, over in Chicago. In August of 2017, the Seventh Circuit handed down a definitive ruling. The court was split. On one hand, it upheld the murder conviction itself. The evidence against Stephenson was pretty strong, and the other claims of ineffective assistance just weren't enough to overturn the guilty verdict. But, when it came to the death sentence, the court ruled differently. It found that the stun belt had actually prejudiced Stephenson during the penalty phase, the part of the trial where the jury chooses between life in prison and execution. The death sentence was reversed. Stephenson would still be convicted of murder, but he would get a new penalty phase trial to decide whether he should be executed or spend the rest of his life in prison. For the families of the victims, this must have felt like, well, reopening old wounds all over again. And then, on May 27, 2025, the case ended in a way no one could have predicted. John Matthew Stephenson, still in prison at the age of 61, suffered a fatal heart attack while playing basketball at the Miami Correctional Facility in northern Indiana. The man who had spent nearly 3 decades on death row and in prison, who had been at the center of the longest and most expensive trial in Indiana history, was suddenly gone. The new penalty phase trial to determine his fate would never happen. Stephenson's attorney reflected on the case, saying it was a case to be remembered, and that really, the chapter is now closed for good.
Yeah.